Dear viewers, welcome to the program Black Sky, Stop Fake. Today, we will delve into the complex phenomenon of Russian propaganda, which positions itself as the last bastion of traditional values. The Kremlin primarily convinces the world that Russia is the guardian of Orthodox Christianity, family, and morality, while the collective West is the epitome of decadence. It sounds lofty, but what lies behind this rhetoric? Today, we will talk about all this on the program Black Sky. Stop Fake invites you to join us. Today, I am joined in the studio by Olga Semashko from Vilnius, good morning, and Wojciech Jankowski from Warsaw. I know that Olga has prepared the substantive foundation for this broadcast, and the topic is precisely these traditional values. And as you can see, this is not only the domain of Russian propaganda, but the essence of the Russian state itself.
Well, I'll tell you how much time I spent on this work. I was entrusted with a large study, and it was quite interesting to delve into these Russian values to see what currently forms their basis and how this differs from what it was, for example, 10 years ago. Back then, so little was said about them. For those who, like me, do not understand what these Russian or so-called traditional values that are now so much talked about really are. The Russians even passed a special law in which they clearly defined this list. It is a very long list, but it includes life, human dignity, rights and freedoms, patriotism and service to the motherland, family, work, justice, spirituality, the priority of spirituality over materialism, as well as the continuity of generations and the unity of the peoples of Russia. Thus, according to the authors of this law, such a set of characteristics should allow Russian people to oppose Western civilization, which they believe is in decline, and preserve their identity in this complex world. We will talk about how Russians themselves perceive these values a little later. First, however, I would like to draw attention to when these values entered the political discourse. Let's say that they became a significant part of Russian politics. As I mentioned, about 10 to 15 years ago. At that time, little was said about it because times were different. But these narratives really began to gain strength in the new era. What in Russia is called the era of the great chess game. Putin, Medvedev, Putin again. And that's when Russia's desire to play these liberal Western games ended. The desire to sit at the same table with Western representatives disappeared, and instead there was a desire to show everyone once again what a great power they are. And then there is the familiar narrative from Soviet politics. Russia, with its high spirituality, attacks the dying West. And where are the ideas? Where is the money? Where is freedom? And even the president is changing? These are very dangerous phenomena for the Russian authorities. In order to lift the spirits of the Russians, so to speak, and to deal with this, a whole policy of traditional values was developed. This narrative was chosen because, let us remember, there had been an economic crisis for many years, and the Russian authorities' rating was not as high as one would have liked, right? Therefore, it was time to guarantee some screepy spiritual bonds. It was impossible to promise a bright future, so the focus was placed on guaranteeing a bright past. Initially, all these traditional values were used exclusively in the domestic market to show Russians the uniqueness of their Russian soul and to demonstrate opposition. We are not like them. And then an export version of these traditional values appeared, to impose them on other nations, primarily neighbors, as traditionalism and Christian values. And you have to understand that this narrative of traditional values is imposed in Russia from above. In other words, it is not a social need at all, but part of Russian policy. In my opinion, representatives of the Russian authorities should embody these values themselves and be a clear example of them. But what do we see? Take, for example, the idea of a strong, happy family. It seems that in such a narrative, we should see a happy Putin with a happy wife and a bunch of little children, and this should not disappear from the screens. But who has seen them in public with their family, with their wife? In their TV series, this topic is simply taboo, as it is in Russian politics. Or take, for example, such a Russian tradition as patriotism. Politicians, officials, and deputies. Everyone talks about it. But what do we see in practice? The children of these same politicians and deputies live and study in the West, in the system that everyone claims to be fighting against. And when we read investigations about how much real estate these Russian officials own in the West, and how much money they have in their accounts, is everything they buy there their traditional value? Spiritual for Russians? For whom is this a priority and more important than material goods? And how do Russians themselves relate to the values that the state is trying to instill in them? Interesting sociological conclusions. Research on this topic is ongoing, and the latest findings were published a few days ago. The study was accompanied by a specific sociological commentary, sponsored by the state. According to the latest data, there is a certain opinion leader. Here are, let's say, the top 3 values for Russians: patriotism and humanism, but the absolute leader is strength. 84% of Russians surveyed say that a strong state is the most important thing. This is their traditional value. And what do Russians mean by that? A traditional family is a union of a man and a woman with children. The more children, the better. Moreover, this family should be strong, happy, and wealthy. But how does all this look in reality? To strengthen family values and support these narratives, political rhetoric about the country and a strong nation is used. And so, 2024 in Russia was even declared the year of the family. But what happened? Something went wrong in the 24th year. Russia ranked 3rd in the world in terms of the number of divorces. This means that for every 10 new marriages, there were 8 divorces. And of course, they began to wonder what to do about it. And now, in order to preserve families, an analogy immediately comes to mind with how the family was treated in the Soviet Union, as the basic social unit. And now they have come up with this reconciliation procedure that is supposed to take place before a divorce. It is women who suffer from these traditional family values, and they suffer in the literal sense of the word. I am talking about domestic violence. General statistics are either not kept or are collected by law enforcement agencies, but not published. Basic data is provided by various social organizations. Yes, in 2021 and 2022 alone, about 200 women were killed by their partners and husbands in Russia. In practice, this means 1 woman in 3. And the law on domestic violence in Russia has not been passed. For several decades, there have been discussions on how to solve this problem. The vast vast majority of Russians, both men and women, support legal regulations. But this issue is simply not moving forward, and I don't think it will happen in the near future, given what is happening in Russian society. The problem now is that there are people who are called SWO, war participants. They are returning from the front, and a significant number of them are committing domestic violence. Under such circumstances, the relevant legislation simply will not be adopted.
Perhaps, Olga, this is because these are traditional values. I mean domestic violence. Perhaps these are Russian traditional values. I remember that a few years ago, these acts were completely decriminalized, with only administrative liability imposed for them. That is, they were equated with petty hooliganism. In fact, if such a crime exists, the prosecutor does not prosecute a man or woman who commits domestic violence. Maybe that's the traditional value, that you can use violence.
I wanted to see how the Russian authorities explain why they did not adopt this legislation. As for Belarus, this topic was also widely discussed there. Here is the argument for why the law was not adopted. Belarusian society is allegedly not yet ready to condemn domestic violence. But when I look at the statistics on Russian attitudes, I see that society is completely ready. Support is 80 to 90%. I just don't know who is holding back this process. But in any case, I don't see any prospects for the adoption of this law at the moment, because we read the chronicles and news about people returning from the war. The level of violence on their part is simply unbelievable. And if we continue this line of thought, these are the Russian скрепы, the so-called traditional values.
Калі вось мы будзем вяртацца далей да скрэп расійскіх, так, да традыцыйных каштоўнасцей, то наступнае
Next issue. In light of the current demographic situation, the Russian authorities are actively encouraging young women to have children. This is already happening even in schools. If earlier it was something to be ashamed of at school, now it is the rhetoric of politicians who sound completely serious on television screens. They promise some material compensation, saying that all this will be rewarded. They claim that women should start giving birth no later than at the age of 20 and have as many children as possible. But from what I can see, few people have believed in or supported this policy. Russians themselves understand that the demographic situation in the country is not the most favorable. They agree that they should have large families, that they should have 7 or more children. However, these same Russians believe that it would be better to have this number of children in another country. That is why they say they support this policy, but do not want to have 3 or more children themselves. According to statistics, the majority of Russian families, over 50%, have only 1 child and 33% have 2. Only 12% have 3 or more children.
Демографічна ситуація у Росії навіть заборонена
To improve the demographic situation in Russia, a movement has been launched against the child-free ideology, which, in their opinion, comes from the West. This movement is banned at the legislative level, and the media, bloggers, and other public figures who promote it face huge fines, which Russians are widely discussing. For example, the topic of abortion is also being discussed with the view to improving demographics. A new round of this discussion began at the end of 2023, catalyzed by the Russian Orthodox Church. At that time, Patriarch Kirill proposed a ban on abortions in private clinics and a general tightening of regulations. However, the authorities, particularly Putin, took a more cautious stance, arguing that the issue should be approached in a balanced manner and that the reaction of society should be awaited. Currently, some restrictions are being considered, such as a ban on abortions in private clinics, but for now, these are only discussions. In reality, decisions are being made at the regional level. There is an entire region in Russia, the Vologda Oblast, where, although abortions are not prohibited by federal law, it is practically impossible to have one. This is because Orthodox activists there either oppose it or the local authorities have introduced a number of restrictions. So, this issue is currently being resolved in Russia in a creeping manner at the regional level, although there has not yet been a total ban.
Нам просто звязваюць гэтыя каштоўнасці
And since I have already started talking about the Russian Orthodox Church, it plays an important role in protecting these traditional Russian values. The point is to link state values with those represented by the Russian Orthodox Church, because the list of traditional values of the Church appeared even earlier. It seems that it was recorded in the documents of the Council, and it so happens that it coincides with what is currently written in Russian law. I would just like to remind you that Russia is a secular state, but the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in matters concerning the military, morality, and values is very significant. The Church acts as a kind of guide for the ideas of the state.
І ось так само знайшла апошнюю статистику, що 4 з 5 росіян.
It was interesting to see how much Russians themselves trust the Russian Orthodox Church. To what extent do they consider it part of themselves? I found the latest statistics. 4 out of 5 Russians describe themselves as believers, about 70%. The Orthodox faith has retained its followers. However, for most Russians, faith is simply one of the traditional values, such as the national idea or the faith of their ancestors, a kind of code of moral norms. In practice, this means that people who call themselves Orthodox in Russia rarely go to church. Their affiliation is limited to wearing a cross. Many only remember their faith during major holidays such as Christmas and Easter. Only 5% attend church regularly. These are churchgoers who make up a very small percentage of the population.
Малий процент насельництва.
Yes, that is the reality. But there is also the image we started talking about, the image of Russian traditional values that is conveyed to Western society. Here, the entire West is presented as a kind of decadent and postmodern creation that fights against tradition. Russia very often uses many sources to influence Western public opinion. These are primarily media holdings, both state-owned and private. We can talk about state-owned ones, such as Sputnik or Russia Today, but also about Spars TV, Orthodox TV, or the entire media holding of Malofeyev, the same Orthodox oligarch. I am also referring to the Tsargrad television channel, which plays a very important role in broadcasting to Western audiences. But there are also bot farms, which operate at a slightly lower level, on social networks. And this is currently a very important aspect of their activities. There are also fake operations such as doppelganger, creating fictitious clone sites of Western media and promoting Russian narratives there, which they later use in their own propaganda and historical programs to show how degraded Western society is and how well we live in Russia. We even know stories of how people from the West come.
Ось я хотіла і сказати, що на некоторих це узденеж.
That's what I wanted to say. It affects some people. You have to admit that there are people in the West who don't fully share liberal values, and propaganda has an impact on them. Although Russian propaganda simply exploits this. It all started when they began talking about traditional values that are opposed to the West. There was even an idea to create an entire American village near Moscow where people from the West would come. All those who support traditional values oppose same-sex marriage and do not want their children to see it. They reject the liberal agenda so that their children can grow up in a normal environment. And such people really do come.
Well, we often see various Western speakers. For example, Tucker Carlson, who comes to Moscow and talks about the wonderful Russian food, which is not only cheaper but also healthier than American food. Or Errol Musk, Elon Musk's father, who comes and also shows how wonderful this place is, where wives walk with their husbands and children. After all, they came to a conference organized by Malofeyev and Dugin. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Future 2050 conference, which took place in Moscow. There are also many other Western speakers, such as Charlie Kirk and Dinesh D'Souza, who convey this to Western audiences in English in a very modern way that resonates with Western society. Yes, if we refer to what you said about reality, it is Orwell in all his glory. It is the complete opposite of what Russia really is. And what you said about religious attachment in Russia, Russian society was the most secular of all the republics of the Soviet Union. Why did they fight so hard for Ukraine in a religious sense? Because most of the income of the parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, came from the territory of Ukraine. The largest Russian church received money from believers in Ukraine, which was very ridiculous and funny in the context of how they wanted to defend these values.
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize that these traditional values, which are currently being promoted in Russia at the highest level, are, if you believe the statistics, practically a kind of show. Everything is very well organized there. The list of these values is presented to them on television, as if to say, we are so strong, so happy, self-sufficient. We don't love money, we only love spiritual values. Everyone is a patriot and so on. But in reality, the results of surveys presented by sociologists show something completely different. Russians just nod their heads. Well, it's propaganda. That's how it has to be. And we'll talk about values, but in reality, they don't share many of these things.
Yes, that's right. Here, the rhetoric of traditional values has become a state-building myth of Russia, so to speak, a kind of 1,000-year-old civilization that defends values and the soul. And the West is an uprooted globalist kingdom of relativism. There is a dichotomy. Here, in Russia, there is sanctity, and there is not. That is, the sacred and the profane. And to this day, it seems that this is being imposed not only in Russia itself, but worse, in Western Europe and the United States. Here, unfortunately, I would like to ask how this looks from the Polish perspective, but due to technical problems, Wojciech will not be able to answer this question. Finally, I see that our program is coming to an end. Thank you very much, Olga, for preparing such a comprehensive collection of information, real information. Anyone who does not believe it can check it out. Often, even Russian structures themselves provide facts and data that you simply need to know and read. Even in the Russian information space, you can find not what propagandists say, but what official structures convey to citizens. Unfortunately, many people only use opinions and propaganda rather than verified information. Thank you, Olga, for the talk.
Thank you.
This concludes our broadcast on Black Sky. Stop fake, like and share our video so that it reaches more people. See you next time.